So I'm just going to say a few things about the collective by way of introduction for those of you who weren't here last week. So the UC Speculative Futures Collective was established through a UC multi-campus research programs and initiative grants at the end of 2018. Our symposia, and we've had 3 already. This is the 4th, and we're going to be culminating in a multi-day conference hosted by UC San Diego sometime next year. So our symposia have brought together faculty, graduate students and undergraduates, as well as artists, activists, and community members, building on the premise that in order to create a better world, we first have to imagine it. The mission of the collective is to make space and provide funding for projects that develop speculative cultural forms and theories that might help to address issues of ecology, gender, sexuality, race, and inequality. We insist on the importance of tarrying with the speculative, if not as a refurbished name for the creative imagination, then as the name for that precious space-time that is the prerequisite for emancipation's first move. So today's panel, Borders, brings together 4 really wonderful presentations that I think are very much in conversation with each other, and I'm really eager to hear how our panelists put their presentations and their work into conversation. So these are presentations that will take us around the globe, undermining ideologies of the border at every turn. They range from Angel Island and floating cities in the Pacific to Vietnam, the US-Mexico border, and Brazil. If, as I suggested last week, emancipation hates a border, then today's presentations will provide ample evidence as to why, through their interrogation of issues of militarization and economic migration, indigenous futures, Cold War surveillance technology, and alternate modes of geopolitical organization. Again, I'm just super excited about the conversation today. And one thing I should note before moving on is that, onto our first presentation, is that many of the presentations today, and many of the presentations throughout this symposium are works in progress whose research is being funded by the Speculative Futures Collective through grants that we've issued to them. So thanks again to all our grant recipients for your patience this summer, especially as I've navigated the arcana of UC finances. As it turns out, it's very difficult to cut people checks in the UC system. So the very last thing I'll say, and then I'll move on to our first presentation, is just to put on everyone's radar, our panel next week, titled Knowing Toxicity, will be on Friday, October 23rd from 12 to 2 p.m. PST, and I hope to see you there. Okay, so on to our first presentation. And for the presenters, we're just going to go in the order that you're listed on the program, if that's all right. And again, keep it under 20 minutes or so. I will send you time signals via private chat when you hit 5 minutes and then 1 minute. But we're not going to be too hard and fast on this because we have two very capacious hours for our session today. So our first presenter, Heejoo Park, is a PhD candidate in English at the University of California, Riverside. She is currently working on her dissertation, Speculative Refractions, Migrant Aesthetics of Asian and Latinx Americas, which examines contemporary works of speculative fiction by Latinx and Asian American writers that expand popular discourse on migration and migrant subjectivities. So Heejoo, take it away.
Okay, let me first share my screen. Okay. So thank you, Chris, for organizing this panel, and thank you everyone for coming. And I wanted to reiterate what you began our symposium with last week, that emancipation hates a border, and my presentation on Unsettling Border Imperialism, Speculative Geographies of Qianru Yamashita through the Arc of the Rainforest, and Malka Older's Centenal cycle hopes to contribute to that conversation by thinking what are the steps for the emancipation that dislodges the logic of borders and all of this geopolitical imaginations. So let's see. Okay. So as artificial as they are, borders have become these naturalized logics through which we orient our everyday lives into proprietary relations to time and space within the nation states. Even as the distinction between the global north and the global south has been very effective at exposing the socioeconomic inequalities generated and exacerbated by the global capitalism, those terms nonetheless rely on border logics that create an inside and an outside. Certainly, imagining a world without borders is a utopian project that seems to be always slightly out of reach. Yet, always out of reach, yet to move beyond such a conceptual impasse, borders may be better understood as a set of contingent processes rather than fixed size and events. To extend such line of inquiry, I engage with what writer and activist Harsha Walia defines as border imperialism, thinking with and through what she calls, rather than conceiving of immigration as a domestic policy issue to be managed by the state. The lens of border imperialism focuses the conversation on the systemic structuring of global displacement and migration through and in collusion with capitalism, colonial empire, state building, and hierarchies of oppression. As a mode of analysis, border imperialism offers a comprehensive framework for connecting collective struggles that seem disparate and idiosyncratic due to spatio-temporal divides between them, and reveals how existing connections across borders can be either obscure or fabricated to provide alibis for maintaining racial hierarchies within settler colonial states, such as the United States and Brazil. In response to such global game of optics, such approach reveals how instances of border crossings are the results of asymmetrical power relations between not only nation states, but more significantly empires, calling for a consideration of trans-imperial approach alongside the transnational. At the same time, the broad frame of border imperialism also presents a representational challenge, which has also been at the center of scholarship on race and ecology and environmental justice, as in Rob Nixon's Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor. Nixon makes a compelling argument regarding two types of ecological violence and contends that while we are adept at recognizing violence as an event or an action that is immediate in time, explosive and spectacular, a different kind of violence that he calls slow violence, incremental and accretive, remains largely invisible to our eyes. Similarly, the challenge presented by the pervasive reach of border logic is also one of scale. The central guiding question for my project is, at what scale can the numerous lives made precarious through securitization of borders and the multi-layered violence they experience be effectively accounted for? So my interest in creating a conversation between Yamashita through the arc of the rainforest and older Centenal cycles comprised of infomocracy, null states, state tectonics, lies in their use of speculative aesthetics, in challenging the dominant narratives that continue to displace the causes of political, economic, and ecological crisis onto the bodies of the racial others migrating from the global south to the global north. These texts make visible on multiple scales how border control has emerged and evolved as a technique of global capitalism and how that convergence might be undone. Read together, they also provide a multi-generational migrant worldview, bringing into focus the interconnectedness of Asia and Latin America, as well as Asian Americans, Latinas in the United States through the circulation of capital and migrant labor. So in thinking through and examining the kinds of speculative geographies presented by this text, I ask again that question of scale and think through the potential of these speculative geographies that are not perfect as an end goal, but as a way to create openings in imagination. I put pressure on these three main qualities, which are palimpsestic, in the sense that they excavate the marginalized histories in reimagining our relations to space, and in terms of putting pressure on the speculative, not only in terms of shifting our visual focus away from the current geopolitical borders, but in wedging open the foreclosures that keep happening over again in time. And also in thinking through the relational through these multiple geographic axes by not reenacting the kinds of other forms of dispossession by just shifting other kinds of border instead of dismantling the logic of borders themselves. So these are the main things that I try to trace in my project, but for the purpose of this presentation, I focus primarily on Malka older Centenal cycles and the kind of micro-democratic system she invents to create this alternate speculative geography. So set in the 22nd century, Cuban-American writer Malka Older's post-cyberpunk political trilogy, Centenal Cycle, speculates a world in which new forms of political governance called microdemocracy has emerged under the supervision of information, a supranational organization that seems to be a hybrid of the United Nations and Google. In this fictional world, nation states had all but disappeared except in the form of what is called null states, with significantly reduced powers. Yet the world has not become entirely borderless. Instead, the former territories of participating nations have been divided into population-based geographic units of centenals, each of which contains 100,000 people, to be incorporated into the microdemocratic system. The first installment of the series, Infomocracy, opens in the wake of the third global election held every 10 years, in which citizens of each centenal vote to choose their own government among the list of numerous political parties on their ballots, regardless of their geographic location. As a party with the most centenals across the globe is granted the privileged status of the supermajority, the election season is depicted as ripe with scandals, even as the information strives to keep the transparency of the election process and prevent the spread of misinformation. Due to the amount of surveillance encroaching upon privacy of individuals, many readers have classified the Centenal cycles as a dystopian fiction. But I contend that the kinds of the imagination that Older grapples with puts pressure on this kind of colonial and capitalist legacy of mapping, especially not only natural resources, but also data in the era of surveillance capitalism. So in Extractive Zone, Macarena Gomez-Barres talks about the game of optics that makes certain nodes visible and transparent while other nodes are obscured in the service of capitalism. So Barres writes, for instance, information confidentiality and corporate oversight function in ways that include turning non-renewable natural resources into opaque nodes of digital information that are hidden away from public debate. At the same time, geospatial technology requires the opposite form of visuality, rendering natural deposits of human and non-human life transparent, mapping to accumulate, convert, and expand the global economy. While she envisions a world that is governed by information and microdemocracy, she does not present this over-reliance on technology as a way to combat the ways in which things are obscure, but rather as something that reveals more deeply embedded problems in the logic of mapping out data for these extractive logics. Okay. So I'm not going to touch on the various palimpsestic trajectories that Older traces in her work, but in contrast to a lot of techno-orientalist works that creates new geographies over the colonial logics, she presents this deeply contentious world that she presents even in the absence of the borders as they are today. So here we have the main character, Ken, meeting another informant, and Ken is a Japanese-Brazilian migrant who has returned to Tokyo, but he is interacting with another Okinawan native informant, talking about how these memories of the colonial legacies of the US military base in Okinawa is not something that can be created over with new forms of political potentiality. But however, by discarding the nation state as the sole authority on who should be allowed to move when and where, Older speculates on whether such change of global scale might be able to mitigate the gap between the privileged and the less privileged forms of migration. Notably, the legal distinction between immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers that are designed to deter the movement people rather than enable it are redefined in Older's version of the future, although the debate around how the movement of people should continue to be regulated is far from over. And in thinking through disasters as a state of exception, she points out how this state of exception are not something to be only contended with in the aftermath of the event, but as a proactive reimagining of what it means to share a space and what it means to be in relation to another. So in particular case of the first installment in Infomocracy, she talks through this uses earthquake as a catalyst for upending the sedimented histories that are present in Tokyo. But I wanted to also bring in the discussion. Well, there are lots of examples from the United States that I could bring into this project, especially within the upheavals that we have been experiencing in the last few months. I wanted to point toward a current example that puts pressure, especially on the particular kinds of the visuals that different kinds of immediate and social violences present. For instance, the explosion near the industrial waterfront in Beirut, Lebanon that occurred on August 4th, including during the ongoing global COVID pandemic, brought attention to the kafala system, a condition under which many migrant domestic workers in the region have been carving out their lives. While the security camera footages showing various migrant workers rescuing young children in their charges were widely circulated in media as heroism of the masses. Those stories sharply contrast with the difficulty of finding out how many of migrant workers were affected by the explosion and what is being done to support them as opposed to citizens. According to the Daily Mirror, around 250,000 foreign laborers were living in Lebanon, and 25,000 among them were from Sri Lanka, many of whom were unable to return home due to high cost of repatriation flights during the pandemic and already dealing with loss of jobs and shelter. As in the case of the Beirut explosion, the immediate violence of disasters reveals everyday violence that receive less attention from the international community. And in doing so, I wanted to return the kinds of the ground zero of the imagination that we are dealing with today in connecting trajectories throughout the Centenal cycle back to Qianru Li Yamashita's through the arc of the rainforest. In thinking through how pandemics create pressure on the border, the kind of national and bodily borders, but at the same time are focused on racial contagion instead of actual viral contagions, create this kind of conceptual impasse in which we are not able to adequately respond to and think about alternative units of care that are not about belonging into the nation in terms of citizenship, in terms of having a legal status, to think through what kinds of alternative speculative wedges might be put into rethinking the borders. And this is something that has evolved into a very personal topic as an international student living and studying in the United States, and having gone through this kind of upheaval through the ICE revisions and the Department of Homeland Security revisions on these kind of conditions of stay. even as travel bans and other kinds of pandemic measures makes it impossible for us to move across the globe in a protected manner. So I wanted to end there by thinking through like what is at stakes in thinking through these multiple layers of disasters that we are contending with on top of the current border logics. And I am going to end it there.
Thank you so much, Heejoo. So next up we have Nguyen-Le, who is a queer Vietnamese American filmmaker and PhD student in the Visual Studies program here at UC Irvine.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Chris. I'm going to also share my screen real quick. Oh. Okay. All right, just a quick note. I will have clips, but they don't have sound, so don't worry if you can't hear them because you're not meant to hear them. Yeah, so today I'm presenting part of an ongoing research project that is tentatively entitled Technologies of Displacement, Cinema, Military, and Refugee Labor. So this project is a part of my attempt to sort of patch together what I see as often separate fields of scholarship. So there's the development of real-time computer visualization for surveillance that was developed during the Cold War, and particularly in the Vietnam War. There's a development of the Vietnam War as a genre in American cinema. And then lastly, the kind of place of refugees in the aftermath of the war, and particularly in this project, I'm going to be looking at what I see as kind of understudied, so so refugee labor within electronics manufacturing. So as Nicole Staroselski points out, the language of globalization often kind of overstates deterritorialization, lots of syllables. So this idea that the world is becoming more borderless, more connected, smaller, due to the proliferation of digital technology and media, obscures the way that our globe is connected, and is still being mapped out and territorialized because of these technologies. So my hope is that by paying close attention to what I know best, which is films, and looking at the circulation of visualization technology, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means, and the flows of labor that make it possible, this kind of way of looking at films can help make visible the ways in which borders are still being drawn and redrawn in our like quote unquote globalized world. So I'm going to start by talking about films. They're sort of random, but so the first one is a very known one, Apocalypse Now, which is like well talked about. It was made in 1979. And actually a recent film that I feel like no one saw called Kong Skull Island, which was released, somebody saw it, Julia Lee saw it, okay, which was released in 2017. And I kind of put the posters side by side because Kong Skull Island is very much inspired visually by Apocalypse Now. So in 2015, the film Kong Skull Island became the first Hollywood film of its scale to be filmed within the borders of Vietnam since the end of the war in 1975. So there were a lot of attempts to do like really big scale films in Vietnam. There were a lot of films that were made about Vietnam in the aftermath of the war, but a lot of them were filmed in other countries, such as the Philippines or Thailand, or even in the United States and UK. And while there were American productions in Vietnam, there wasn't anything of the scale that was set during the war itself. And for those of you who have seen the film, Kong isn't really about the Vietnam War. It's just like kind of like set in the Vietnam War as like the backdrop. So they don't, I don't know. And so in this movie, the director Jordan Vogt-Roberts reimagines the famous story of King Kong taking place in 1973 near the end of the Vietnam War. And in numerous interviews, his reasoning for it is that such an uncharted island would have been discovered after that because of the prevalence of global satellite surveillance. So because of the technology that's being developed during the Vietnam War, there's no way that we couldn't find an uncharted island where King Kong lives after the Vietnam War. So I'm just gonna play this clip real quick. There's no sound, just so you can get a sense of what the film looks like. And there's a funny joke there about Richard Nixon as a bobblehead. Oops, no, don't play again. Stop, pause. Okay. So while this film is not necessarily about the Vietnam War itself, it's clearly influenced by Apocalypse Now, for those of you who've seen it. A lot of the helicopter scenes and the color kind of matches that of Francis Ford Coppola's film. And Coppola once said of his film Apocalypse Now, "My film is not about Vietnam, it is Vietnam. It was what it was really like, it was crazy, and the way we made it was very much like the way Americans were in Vietnam." And Coppola has since been heavily criticized by this for this grandiose kind of statement that equates his film to an entire like nation of people. But I think there's something interesting about paying attention to the process of making film and equating it to war. And that's kind of like where I sort of draw some of my inspiration. So what you see here is some behind the scenes. So I'm not going to show you that famous helicopter sequence that plays to Flight of the Valkyries that has been repeated in multiple films. But here's a sort of like drawing story. So back in the day, you had to like draw stuff out, right? It looks like this. This is a cinematographer. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but he's literally strapped onto the side of the helicopter with a camera, and they're gonna film it that way. So this is back in 1979. So sort of like, you know, fast forward to 2015. Oh, actually, I'm gonna show you some behind the scenes too of Coppola's film. So again, there's no sound, but you know, so these are like real explosives that they used, and they made this film in the Philippines. So they built a set and they exploded it. So fast forward to, oh no, stop replaying. Okay, I'm gonna stop pressing it like that. Oh, it just automatically wants to play. Okay, so I'll talk while it loads. Oh no, stop. Okay. Yeah, so Apocalypse Now was infamous for its production hardships. Coppola came to the Philippines, which was formerly annexed by the US, to make his film about Vietnam, since there were no foreign relations between the two countries. Apocalypse Now was filmed 1 year after the end of the war. And when he came to the Philippines in 1976, Ferdinand Marcos, the country's infamous dictator, agreed to let him hire the Filipino army to borrow the helicopters from the army, which were the same ones that were used by the US in the Vietnam War, and to build, destroy life-size sets, and to hire people as extras for a very low wage. So it's not just random that the Philippines had these helicopters. It is because the Filipino army was highly entangled within the US Army, and they were also dropping bombs in Vietnam during the war. So it wasn't only a location, but one that already had existing pathways due to its entanglement with the US military. And that's how they were able to make this film with like such a quote unquote like realistic feeling. So unlike Apocalypse Now, Skull Island, even though it's filmed in Vietnam, doesn't have to blow stuff up. And I'm going to show you just a little bit behind the scenes. Okay, that's all I'm going to show you. But basically, even though they filmed on location in Vietnam at these very beautiful locations, they're not, doing Francis Ford Coppola's like explosions and everything down to the helicopters and the fires are VFX. Um, so I wanted to trace what made what I'm going to broadly call VFX possible back to the technology that was developed during the Vietnam War. So in a similar way to the makers of Kong Skull Island, the US military was trying to find a way to reduce the casualties and, create a more contained and less quote unquote destructive war. So one of these experiments was an Operation Igloo White. And they did this by so they invested in this idea of an electronic battlefield to visualize in close to real time what was going to go on from the battlefield from afar. So in 1968, the largest building in Southeast Asia was an it's the Infiltration Surveillance Center in Thailand. So it's headquarters of this operation. And basically, what was happening, I'm going to go back to this photo, is in the first picture, they had these sensors that they would drop from planes, and those would implant into the ground in Vietnam. And these unmanned helicopters, which are sort of like, not copters, I'm sorry, planes that are the precursors of drones, would just kind of fly around and pick up the signal and ping it back to the headquarters in Thailand. And at this time, IBM is really involved in this operation and sends a whole crew over to run it. So up here is kind of that very old visualization, so that it kind of indicated the shift in military strategy. So whereas before you had standing armies, you would send people, this would enable the United States military to kind of like quote unquote see where large armies are gathering and then just drop bombs from afar. And this sounds very familiar because they continue this kind of trajectory of military tech into what is now the war on terror that's ongoing, into like drone warfare. But this is like the very first precursor, and the creation of visualization technology enables this. So ultimately, the project is unsuccessful and the US doesn't win the Vietnam War. But despite this failure, these same sensors were installed into 9 parts of the US's southwest border between 1973 and 1977. So this isn't where they're located. This is a newer map about the kind of high-techiness of the US-Mexico border, but it kind of starts from that moment when, the war ends and they have a surplus of like random surveillance technology that kind of worked. So, and then that's not the only thing so this is a picture of this steel is also from helicopter landing pads made during the Vietnam War. And this is a newer wall that was built more recently. And so those of you who have visited San Diego know that it's not just one wall, but it's like 3 kind of weird discombobulated walls in addition to sort of high-tech surveillance. So shortly after Vietnam War, this technology is recycled at the border. And according to historian Tim Dunn, this is also the period when the border becomes increasingly militarized. There's a 1981 act that enables the military to basically lend its weapons and excess things to the police and to Border Patrol. And again, we see that the kind of ongoing legacy of that to this day. So sorry, this slide is not as nice as the others. So the technology wasn't the only thing that was coming from Southeast Asia. So in 1975 and through the early 1990s, there was a large exodus of refugees from Southeast Asia. So this mass migration also coincided with this militarization of the border for one, and then the government's subsidy of the electronics, computers, aerospace industries to create what they were calling a defense industrial base, basically preparing the United States for like ongoing forever war. So whereas in the past, like there wasn't kind of like a base that was like ready to just roll out whenever war was happening, this is really kind of bolstering the defense, bolstering these industries through government subsidies, and the defense budget increases by 51% within 5 years in the 1980s. My own father, who's a refugee of the war, was placed in a job in a factory in Los Angeles manufacturing radar parts and telecommunications for the US military. So it's a private company that took in a lot of refugees to train them and give them jobs after migrating to the United States. But he wasn't the only one who ironically was running away from war and ending up working to build technology that fights war. In 1985, the Office of Refugee Resettlement reports that the single largest occupation for Vietnamese refugees, aside from beauty service industry, was as assemblers in electronics factories. So during this electronics boom, which is like building the military base, there's also sort of a boom in Silicon Valley. There's personal computers are becoming a thing. The chips are getting smaller, and they really needed a manufacturing labor force. And that is sort of how San Jose becomes a hub of Vietnamese people. So this is where the role of visual effects comes back in. To have visual effects, you need computers, you need hard drives, you need graphics processors. And this pivot kind of constituted a huge existential dilemma in my field of film studies, because now we're struggling to define the borders of our own discipline. If there's no film, there's no celluloid anymore, then what exactly are we studying? And it's in these kinds of times that I'm reminded that even the immateriallessness of digital films often rely on material infrastructures. And so this is just sort of the graphic of the many different layers of destruction that are virtual. So in Kong School Island, going back to that film, it's marketed as an exclusive and spectacular view of Vietnam that has never been seen this way before in film. So a lot of the crew say that in the behind the scenes featurettes. They insistently comment on the untouched nature of the landscape and how friendly the attitudes of the local villagers are to see them, the film crew, make this film. And I think they attribute the friendliness to the fact that they're not blowing up stuff. But the director actually becomes a travel and tourism ambassador for Vietnam for 3 years, and he relocates to Vietnam after making this film. He kind of just like escapes his Hollywood life. So visual effects that are so common in spectacular films produced in Hollywood are possible by early developments of electronic battlefield technology and its subsequent use to surveil the United States borders. So at the same time that national borders are being reinforced by this technology, they're also being crossed by global capitalism that comes with making films. Films take a lot of money, and they take a lot of foreign money, and they take a lot of foreign investment. And that was one of the things that marked Kong's entrance into Vietnam, is also marking Vietnam's reemergence.
We seem to have lost Wing. Let's just give her maybe 30 seconds to come back in. Okay, so unfortunately we've lost Wing. It was sort of the tail end of her presentation, so if she can come back in, then Greg, we're going to transition to you, but if you don't mind, if when Wing comes back in, maybe we can, if it's early enough in your presentation and we can do this seamlessly, maybe we'll pause and let her sort of wrap things up. Okay, let me introduce you, Greg. So descended from Chinese immigrants and Kanaka Maoli voyagers, Greg Loui always had to explore different identities as a person of mixed heritage in America and Hawaii. He was also obsessed with science fiction as a keiki and searched for a career to express that creativity. After learning to combine his heritage with storytelling through the speculative design program at UC San Diego, Greg found that career as he explores past, present, and future through indigenous futurism. He's currently a member of the Indigenous Futures Lab at UC San Diego, which he will tell us much more about in his presentation. So Greg, why don't you take it away?
Oh, Qian is back.
Oh, okay. Wing, do you
Hello,
want to?
sorry.
Yeah. So you're the second person to get kicked off of the Zoom meeting. Do you want to finish up?
Sure. I'll just wrap it up.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just wrap it up by saying, by paying attention to like the behind the scenes production, and the kind of technological itineraries of this technology. It kind of reveals a lot about kind of the global reach of US empire. So it's not just that films reflect ideology, but in many ways they kind of follow this kind of pathway that it already existed because of the military. And because I got kicked off for so long, I'll just end it there.
Thank you so much. I mean, we'll follow up with that in the conversation during Q&A, but that was truly fascinating. Thank you. So Greg, why don't you pick it up?
Okay. Well, thank you all for having me here, and thank you, Qian. I hope we can learn more during the Q&A. Okay, so considering that my topic is about indigenous futures and we are talking about borders, it does seem important to at least acknowledge that UC San Diego and the larger UC system is on native land and has majorly profited off of the indigenous land that was for the most part unceded. So onto my presentation, which is about redefining Pasifika settlements in the climate crisis. So for a little bit of context, so what is Pasifika? Pasifika is kind of the newer term to refer to Pacific Islanders, such as like Micronesians, Melanesians, Polynesians, and maybe even Australian Aboriginals. So when you think about that, that's about 2.3 million people in the South Pacific, 1.4 million people in the US that are ethnically and I think majority Pacific Islander. So like when you think about that, that is basically one of the largest territories in the entire world when you consider how much of the Pacific Ocean dominates our world, and like that's over 100 million square kilometers. That's 15% of the world's surface. That's a huge percent of our world's biodiversity. So in the context of the climate crisis and what is going to happen, the fate of the Pacific Islanders is hugely important towards this discussion, and we need to be a part of it. So when discussing borders, it's important to think of the legacy and the history and the heritage of Pacific Islanders as voyagers, as people who were not really confined by the ocean, who instead saw the ocean as a sea of islands that were all interconnected through the ocean. And through their complex, dangerous, but very well managed, very well designed voyages, the ocean was not an obstacle to them. So as you can see in this map, you can see how much of the Pacific they were able to settle in a very, very small amount of time when you consider it. And when you consider that during this time period, most of the other world's cultures were still confined to the major continents. So that's all very important to remember about Pacific Islanders and about the what we want to think about when discussing the future of Pacific Islanders. So we all know the elephant in the room, the largest event, the largest crisis that's coming to our world. And I think it's fair to say that even COVID will not have as much of an impact as the climate crisis. In fact, the climate crisis will probably cause more and more COVID-like events where our world is disrupted, our world where illnesses and diseases will kind of explode out of nowhere. So within the South Pacific context, we have about 10 years towards a full-blown humanitarian crisis where it's not just sea levels rising where the islands will just sink into the water. This is a very violent and horrifying crisis where storms like hurricanes will occur like basically every month, and the rising sea levels won't just sink homes, they will poison freshwater systems, basically rendering the entire island uninhabitable for like 99% of people. So when you think about the South Pacific in a larger context as well, you got to remember that it's not just Pacific Islanders who live there. There's over 9 million people within the South Pacific region. And so when these people are unable to live in their own islands, you're going to have a humongous climate refugee crisis in a region where like there's no roads. You're going to either need to airlift people out of there, or you're going to need to develop like massive boating systems to take care of these people if you want to save them. But in many cases, such as the Marshall Islands, the climate crisis is already happening. So this future is Pacifica's present. So really, what is the future of life for Pacific Islanders? What does that mean for, what does survival mean? What does thriving mean? What does like continuing the way of life for Pacific Islanders mean? Because we know based off of what's going to happen, everything's going to change. And survival is not exactly a given, but we want to do more than survive. So this is kind of what my presentation has been building towards, the speculation on what exactly the future of Pacifica communities are, because obviously we don't want to think of it becoming a water world situation where all refugees on the ocean, like living on scrap. But we also don't want to think of it as 100% it becomes climate refugees where these Pacific Islander peoples need to go to Australia, New Zealand, or the US. Because I mean, let's be totally honest, the US and all of these countries don't have the greatest record for accepting minorities or refugees. So that really leads us to why speculation is so important for the Pacific context, because obviously none of these current trajectories for the Pacific people are great. So right now, the Indigenous Futures Lab, which I'm a part of, and the Institute for Climate of Peace, which is one of those organizations in Hawaii that I've partnered with, are working to reimagine solutions for the climate crisis, where we're working on thinking of where we could put Pacific Islander refugees in places that we call kipuka, or refuge sites, where it's not like we're dumping them in the middle of San Diego or California. We're taking land that is unused or not really suitable for other people, but we're refurbishing it, making it suitable for Pacific Islanders. So that's one of the things we're thinking about. The other thing we're looking into is past solutions, which is one of the things that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, was that Pacific Islanders and the voyagers did not view the ocean as an obstacle. Instead, it was a home, it was a transportation network. So that's what I want to build up to, is that this thinking that this heritage of being oceanic nomads is something we could return to, where when you look at Austronesian communities, such as the Sama Bajau, the Moken, Orang Laut, and other Asian communities in Southeast Asia. Some people live their entire lives on the waves. Some people can live for decades without ever setting foot on land, except for maybe like trading or religious ceremonies. So this is a very important example to show that humanity is not settled into one mode of community and for civilization. Especially with the Sama Bajau, they've been living this way for thousands of years. And they found ways to adapt themselves within the modern context by using modern materials like fiberglass, using modern technologies, electricity, the whole shebang. So what can we do to combine these past solutions for the future? There's already been a lot of talk where billionaires, entrepreneurs from like Sweden or the US have been trying to buy like islands in the Pacific and like create their own libertarian floating cities. But that's an inherently neo-colonistic and a very violent kind of taking of land and resources that should be really used for the indigenous people of these regions who are going to need these floating cities. So really that's the question of what I want to do with this research is, what if we use these ideas, these technologies to preserve Pasifika people's connections to the ocean, to really transform this way of life that we've settled into back to our heritage and our connection to the ocean. We can not only use that to create healthier ways of living, we can also use it to preserve sovereignty. Because I mean, when you redefine what exactly borders are, when you remove that idea from land, you give sovereignty to the people who have the ability to move around, who have the ability to create their own borders. And really, this is all about creating a future for indigenous people that's beyond, the body surviving. You can preserve their culture, their way of lives, their traditions, but change it so that they have agency. So that's really the question. Could the future of Pacific culture still be on the ocean? Because there's lots of technology out there. There's examples where people have been creating sailing cargo ships. There's been a lot of research into floating photovoltaic systems and farms. And we know that this is possible. We've seen evidence of this for thousands of years throughout the world. So I don't want to take up too much time, but so I'll end it on this one note. Ikava ma mua, kava ma hope. So that's a Hawaiian saying that's kind of found throughout the Pacific Islander community, and that means to look forward into the future by learning from the past is the roughest translation. And that really means that we can use our past, that we don't have to give up our heritage, and we can use that to create a foundation for the future. And that's really what I want to try and do through Indigenous Futures, through this speculation on what Indigenous life could be when we aren't confined to this idea that Indigenous life should be stuck in one place, that you can redefine these communities as around these people rather than around the land and around borders. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that presentation. Mahalo nui loa, and I'm excited for the next presentation.
Thanks so much, Greg, and thanks again for being flexible. Our last presentation today is from Qianru Li, who studies, practices, and documents contemporary Asian American performance. Their research centers on contemporary Chinese diaspora performance in U.S. Chinatowns.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here, and thank you all for coming. My presentation focuses on an island in the San Francisco Bay Area. Angel Island is well known because the Angel Island Immigration Station was a major West Coast immigration portal during the enforcement of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Many scholars and artists have written extensively on this aspect of the island. I want to begin my presentation with a personal anecdote to show you why, as a first-generation Chinese immigrant, I am invested in studying the militarism aspect of this space. It was our island. The military didn't like having those immigrants on the island. One of them said, looking at Michael, then me. In April 2019, I met 3 veterans on a ferry from Tiburon to Angel Island in San Francisco Bay. 3 tall white men standing on the deck with their high and tight military haircut dressed in uniforms. These veterans were part of the military history program on Angel Island that runs from April to October. Following a group of dancers, I was documenting the production process of a site-specific immersive dance performance on early Chinese immigration at the Angel Island Immigration Station. An island could signify many different things. To many Pacific immigrants, Angel Island was a gateway to the US as a country of immigration. However, to military recruits and casuals who were processed through Fort McDowell, Angel Island was a gateway to the US as an empire of war. Strangely, as a contemporary immigrant from mainland China, I have been obsessed with the military history of this island. I thought it was because the Cold War hasn't ended. Not for me. Seeing these veterans on the ferry, my increased adrenaline suddenly unlocks a chest full of questions. All those questions I have, all those questions that have haunted me for a year and a half, looking at them, I know they must have some answers. Wait, not right now, not immediately, not like this. Make them feel comfortable. I look around searching for my supplementary whiteness. They must have answers. Answers to all those questions. Questions like, what was the experience of being on an island with a group of detained travelers? Or, other than suppressing the food protest at the immigration station dining hall, were there any other interactions between the station and the military base? They must have answers. My stomach tells me that in order for me to hear those answers, being a PhD student at UCI is not enough. I look around, searching for more supplementary whiteness. My heart trembles. I see my collaborator, Michael Kennedy, looking at me. Working together for 3 years, Michael knows my research very well. No, we had our own dock. The immigration station had their dock. The man in the middle tries to explain to us. We are 2 facilities from 2 different departments, the man on the left adds. It was our island. The military didn't like having those immigrants on the island. We wanted the island to ourselves. All the air around me just abandoned me for a vacuum. Make them feel comfortable, although I have never felt more at sea. I was wrong. I thought I could handle it. I thought I read too much scholarship claiming and reclaiming Angel Island as a space of immigration. I thought I was ready for some alternative perspectives until I was hit by our island. Part of me knows that they're right. The military was on the island for 99 years, while the immigration station only operated for 30 years. Nor can the population processed at the station compare with the number of military personnel processed at the military base. Of course, it is their island. Staying in academia for too long, sometimes I forget that in numerous situations, we are the alternative perspectives. But is number the only thing that matters? Does occupying an island mean owning an island? Isn't ownership a mystification? The further we are from the coastline, the more I wonder if those early Chinese immigrants were told the same thing on their ferries to the immigration station. When did they become aware that neither the US as a continent nor the US as an archipelago welcomed their arrival? Were they ever asked if they considered this as their island as well? Make them feel comfortable. The invisible knife on the necks of all immigrants. Did the first-class Chinese travelers also feel a need to search for more supplementary whiteness when facing the immigration officials? Additionally, although these veterans seem to be satisfied with two facilities being quarantined from one another, how many potential border crossings, imagined or otherwise, between the immigration station and the Fort McDowell were manifested? With these questions in mind, I write this paper to imagine an alternative geographical mapping that allows a variety of presence to exist simultaneously. I write this paper. Holding both the tangible archive and the intangible repertoire of encounters between the global North and the global South, islands are instrumental for studying resistance against colonial expansion and settler colonial domination. Carrying blueprints, journals, maps, still images, and architectural remains on their backs, islands provide access to a collection of archives regarding the entangled relation between colonialism, settler colonialism, militarism, and migration. The intangible repertoire, as performance studies scholar Diana Taylor insists, includes performances, gestures, orality, movement, dance, singing. In short, all those acts usually thought of as ephemeral, non-reproducible knowledge. Within the context of islands, repertoire could mobilize our understanding of various forms of global South resistance to the global North, because repertoire enacts embodied memory. As Asian American studies scholar Setsu Shigematsu and Keith Camacho argue, being liminal and integral spaces of conquest and occupation, islands are kin under empires and militarized currents. Studying archive and repertoire together will help us identify those kinships that exceed the containment of national and regional borders. Originally a hunting space for the Hukueku, an indigenous group of the Coast Miwok, Angel Island keeps a rich designatory repertoire, a Mexican land grant, an army post, a site for both an immigration station and a quarantine station, a missile site, and the only place in the US with 3 lighthouses. Despite being indigenous land, its current name reveals no trace of indigeneity. The modern name of this island, Angel, or Isla de los Angeles, comes from Spanish colonialism. The name Angel Island has masked the island's non-angelic histories of colonization, militarization, and immigration. Both processes of naming, referring to the biggest island in the San Francisco Bay, Angel, or the United States, a country of immigrants, are self-fashioned identities foreclose other forms of being. In both cases, this violent erasure serves to protect the US society from looking into its own moral abyss. As cats on a hot tin roof, many Americans have become masters of escape. Most publications discussing Angel Island focus on its immigration station, a portion of this island. While these writings compellingly advance our understandings of the US immigration history, they also risk reproducing a favored narrative that constructs the US as a hopeful country of immigrants. Building upon scholarships in performance studies, archipelagic American studies, and global studies, I proposed an alternative historiography and geopolitical mapping for studying Angel Island. As Brian Russell Roberts and Michelle Ann Stephens remind us, Other than water or land, islands are also connected through a set of filamentous networks of airline routes, communications cables, kinship ties, internet connections, and many others. Indeed, examining the repertoire of colonization and militarization on islands in the Pacific will part the waters, uncovering this set of filamentous networks between Angel Island, Hawaii, Guam, Fiji, and many others. In short, I propose a framework that allows concurrent presence from the past, the present, and the future because repertoire by its nature is palimpsest. In other words, if we approach Angel Island as a piece of paper, this palimpsest framework will allow us to realize the simultaneous presence of indigeneity, settler colonialism, immigration, incarceration, and militarism that have all become inextricable components of the island history through writings and rewritings of empires. Designated as a military reserve in 1850, the US Army initiated its presence on Angel Island in 1863. During the Civil War, in order to protect San Francisco from the Confederates, two major islands in the San Francisco Bay, Alcatraz and Angel Island, were occupied by the US Army. As a safeguard, Camp Reynolds was installed on Angel Island in September 1863, after a public recognition that Alcatraz alone was not enough to defend the entire Bay Area. In 1907, the Department of Recruits moved from the San Francisco Presidio to Angel Island, and they transformed into the recruit depot, Fort McDowell. Fort McDowell was the world's largest and the most elaborate military induction center in the 1910s. It processed more than 300,000 troops for US military activities in the Pacific Theater during both world wars. In the meantime, drafted men returning from Hawaii and the Philippines were also processed here. Although understanding Angel Island as an immigration station is the more common way to consider this place, the Angel Island Immigration Station was built on 20 acres of land that was transferred from the War Department in 1905. The station processed 209,000 US citizens and over 341,000 aliens and returning residents. These travelers came from 82 countries, including Japan, Korea, China, Russia, India, and the Philippines. The station is historically significant because of the detention and interrogation of the immigrants that occurred there. For example, it detained around 100,000 immigrants from China during the enforcement of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the first time that the US excluded immigrants based on nationality and race. After the station stopped operating as an immigration portal, it was returned to the War Department in 1940 to accommodate prisoners of war prior to their transfer to inland camps. Despite of its proximity to San Francisco, Angel Island is in effect next of kin with other Pacific islands such as Hawaii, Guam, Fiji, Tonga, and many others. Studying a repertoire of colonization and militarization, the US obsession with islands in the Pacific becomes visible. As Julia Lee reminds us, the US needs places like Angel Island in order to exist. In the eyes of the US empire, islands are particularly well suited for national defense and surveillance because they're perceived as isolated spaces located in the mass borderland of water. Thus, the US empire exploits these islands for their geopolitical importance while constructing them as peaceful paradises that are ideal to promote tourism. In fact, as Bernadette Gonzalez insists, a broad circulation of images of these islands as perfect locations for leisure travel has been a means of hiding an expansionist US empire in the Pacific. As a popular campsite in the Bay Area nowadays, Angel Island is popular for its beaches and natural views. The Immigration Station Museum adds a cultural layer to the repertoire of tourism on the island. However, this cultural tourism has also mystified the US as a country of immigrants. The promotion and circulation of this mystification has potentially attributed immigration to imagine the virtues of this country, an advocate for democracy and human rights at a global scale. Celebrating this mystification risks casting the repertoire of colonization and the militarization of the US empire as comedies of errors. To those who have migrated because of militarism and the war, all those restless days and nights in midsummer, all those questions and waiting for some closure in the dark, and all those moments when crying becomes impossible are left no room of existence under this mystification. To different communities, Angel Island seems to encourage the recuperation of either an immigration presence or a militarized one. However, in a society where privilege is distributed unevenly between communities, selective remembrance could easily lead to policing and erasure of less preferred presence. I am pained to know that both face abandonment and destruction. The immigration station is preserved and renovated for community activism. However, to this day, Fort McDowell is a group of abandoned buildings. After my encounter with those veterans on the ferry, I'm also pained to realize that this physical abandonment does not easily correspond with the power hierarchy in our society. Overwhelmed by ambivalence, my heart trembles again. What does one do when facing the abyss? One does not run away or fall into it. One just sit with it and wonder, is there a space where we could all be present? Not a space of belonging, just a space of presence, simultaneous presence without domination. How far are we from a space like that? What is our investment for a space like that? Considering its complex histories, I insist that Angel Island should be studied together with Hawaii, Guam, and other islands in the Pacific in terms of colonialism, settler colonialism, militarism, and migration. Unlike many of these islands that are still occupied by US military bases, the military history on Angel Island seems to stay in the past. When tourist economies on many other islands in the Pacific are secured through an imperialistic military presence, the abandoned Fort McDowell can no longer fulfill its duty on Angel Island. However, through an examination of the repertoire of colonization and militarization, Angel Island is finally allowed to be present again, along with this other Pacific islands. As Asian American Studies scholar Viet Thanh Quyên reminds us, all wars are fought twice, the first time on the battlefield, the second time in memory. It is my hope that together we will subvert a tendency of favoring one presence over another, restoring justice that is destroyed on the battlefield. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Qianru. So Angel Island as Pasifika. I really love how these papers have been in conversation, in implicit conversation with each other. And now as we turn to Q&A, we can hopefully make some of that conversation explicit now. So the chat should be open to everybody. So feel free to submit questions with your fingers if you prefer that method. But otherwise, I ask and encourage folks to unmute themselves, unmute their videos, and ask questions verbally and via telepresence as well. So, I'm going to let the awkward silence kind of settle in as everybody processes their thoughts. But there are so many rich connections and overlaps, and I think opportunities for really productive synthesis between these presentations. So if you would like, you can raise that virtual blue hand and I can call on you. But yeah, if there are any questions, I have questions for each of the panelists and some sort of general questions that could be posed to the group. But if anybody has any questions that they'd like to start out with, I invite you to do so. Oh, Shelley, our fearless leader, Shelley Strebe, has a question. So Shelley, why don't you go first, and then Evan, you next.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I was having trouble manipulating the interface for a moment. Sorry about that. So I actually have to leave a little early, but I just wanted to say how much I enjoyed each one of these presentations and how much I look forward to seeing the full-blown research projects that emerge from each of them. I also wanted to invite each of you to say more about some of the meanings of the speculative in your work. As I listened, I heard the speculative talked about in a lot of different ways. It made me think of Amy Bong's interventions in Migrant Futures, where she argues that the speculative is not just a genre, but a mode that cuts across multiple cultural forms and practices, and it can be a tool of finance, capitalism, and empire. But it can also be used from below, she shows us, to imagine and create different futures that swerve away from those histories. So in Heejoo's paper, speculative aesthetics seems to make possible alternate imaginings of care that challenge the connections between care, citizenship, and nation states. I thought in Quyên's paper, the speculative when it comes to Hollywood films and technological itineraries seem to be more on the side of imperialism and racial capitalism. In Greg's paper, the speculative seems to be a way of displacing those structures to theorize and co-create other worlds through collective speculative practices. And for the last paper, I'm not sure she used the term, but I wondered if the speculative is connected to the wonderful points about imagining alternative palimpsestic geographies of Angel Island and simultaneous presence without domination. So I just wanted to invite each of you to say a little bit more about whether and how those different meanings of the speculative, and probably multiple meanings I haven't thought of, are important for your projects. And anyway, yeah, it was great. So just anything you all would like to say to that, I'd love to hear it.
I guess I could start. I think the challenges I try to work through in my project was seeing how like multiple levels of the meaning of speculative emerges within the text themselves. I think the first layer of speculation that was happening in both like through the arc and Centenal cycles were creating this structure that are different like visually and conceptually from our current borders, that we are able to trace back the kinds of the movements of capital and imperialism that kind of Nguyen's paper kind of like traces in terms of like, yes, bodies are stopped at these borders, but all of these capitals are flowing, and that shifting of borders kind of like visually allows us to look at those shifts. But at the same time, because they are shifting those things, they are also questioning what kinds of speculation is necessary for really opening up spaces rather than recreating these borders. Like Sentinels, like they are meant to like help people, like as like Qianru is saying, that be present together and not with a nation state. But it's the kind of like the setup of the series tells us that those are very vulnerable to being co-opted again by capitalist forces. So they might not be nation states, but they have this kind of like corporate ones that I didn't really get into, like liberty, heritage, that are just simply like re-coalition of like the corporate, multinational corporates and like nation states of the formal colonial impulses. I think the other kinds of speculation is like pushing against, kind of like in line with what Amy Bong like makes the intervention in migrant aesthetics of like two different layers speculation kind of like warring with each other. I think that's what I'm trying to think through in the project, I think.
I can go next. I appreciate that Heejoo always gives us like such a great like sort of soil to build the rest of what we're gonna say. So from your presentation and then now from your answer. With speculation, I kind of took it literally as I tried to do this project. Is maybe I didn't hit it too hard, but visualization technology becomes pre-visualization technology. So it's not just the VFX are added after, but now there are cameras that can like digitally see King Kong before you even put King Kong into the thing. And these technologies are, and this kind of like speculation, right, of like seeing forward and pre-visualizing. I'm just trying to like trace it more literally in its kind of colonial imperial kind of like background. And I feel like I'm in the context of everyone else's project, it feels like the most dismal. But I do think that there are like non-colonial ways to like make films and, you know, use camera tech, like even though it is so entangled within the kind of like military development.
I guess we're just going in the order of our panels then. Thank you, Professor Strebe, for the great question. And I guess my answer is, I think originally I could have seen speculation as being a very imperialistic, colonizing force, but after learning a lot more about Indigenous futures and the history and heritage involved in Indigenous cultures around speculation, I think especially what we're doing right now is a return to the original form of speculation within Indigenous cultures and reclaiming speculation as a way of survival and cultural introspection for Indigenous and BIPOC cultures. I think it's important to recognize that the speculation can be a tool for both good and bad, and right now we're simply reappropriating it. I guess that's the best way to put it.
Thank you for the question, Dr. Strebe. And thank you for everybody's response. You all said so much better than how I can say it. I look at speculation as an open question, as a question that it just emerged in my head when I set foot on Angel Island. What are the other? Is there other people here? What happened when everybody was here? Was there any encountering? And also just thinking about, especially in the 2020, the global pandemic, thinking about especially this space. Scholar Nguyen Shah, he beautifully articulate that Angel Island is actually a medical border for the country, right? When the Chinese people 100 years ago were suspicious of bringing leprosy, bubonic plague into this country. There are many layers, spatial temporal layers that happen in that space. So I just asked myself, I wonder what happened if we invite everybody to come up, if we have everybody to just be in this space now together, what will happen? So thank you very much for that question. I never really thought about, I started this project because I asked an open question. Thank you.
Okay, Evan, did you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. This is a beautiful panel. I really appreciate and learned so much from all your papers. I have a question for Quyên and then Greg. And so Quyên, I just want to say I really love your presentation. I think it's a super fascinating project to think about Vietnam War cinema, as well as visual surveillance and visual surveillance technologies, and also thinking, I really appreciate the emphasis on the materiality of these visual technologies and also the materiality of how the US-Mexico border wall was produced by all of these helicopter pads. I want to invite you to pick up on your answer to Shelley's question and to talk about non-colonial forms of visualization of the Vietnam War and its afterlives, and if you can talk a little bit about your film practice and how you see your films perhaps intervening into these other high cinema or Hollywood cinema films that are trying to articulate the Vietnam War in a different way. And then maybe I'll just say my question for Greg. Greg, thank you so much for your presentation. I'd just love to hear you talk a little bit more about the relationship between indigeneity and voyaging. I know that a lot of American Indian studies, for example, is really articulates importance very strongly of the relationship with land. And I think that's something that Pasifika studies can do, is also get us to think about indigenous relationality with water. And so I just love to hear you talk a little bit more about that dynamic and how that informs our visions for the future going forward.
Thanks for that question, Evan. I think as a scholar, I'm so much more dismal than I am when I'm an artist. And maybe that's why it's important to kind of like do both. So when I make films, I don't really actually, I guess, think much about, oh, who made this camera? And was it like, where did it come from? And more sort of invested in kind of like the narrative representational aspect. And in many ways in the production itself as a way for underrepresented people in the industry, or in my case very specifically, I make films about queer Vietnamese Americans. And so how to employ people also in the background of like those productions and not just in front of the camera. But I think sort of like what this project has opened for me, the project about like tracing the visualization and the VFX has opened for me as like a question about like how to differently view a very popular genre of like American film, which like, you know, a lot of Vietnamese Americans kind of hate on. And I also do as well, but then we keep finding ourselves here and people keep making films. Spike Lee just made a film and there's really mixed reviews about, you know, whether or not people like it. So kind of like, because I make films, I think I'm always interested in what happens behind the scenes, and it kind of shows, it's so much more interesting to me sometimes than like the films themselves, although I admittedly do love seeing CGI King Kong beat on CGI octopus. I don't know if this directly answers your question, because I think there's a lot of space to kind of critique technologies. I know there's a lot of work about like the camera being colonial, but I'm also thinking about the spectator and the power of the spectator to kind of like look the other way, look differently. And it's, I think film sometimes doesn't have as much like ideological indoctrination power as like people think it does. I'm sorry, I'm trying to like round back to your question because I keep going otherwise, but let me see, what was I gonna say? Yeah, I'm always, there's kind of a rhetoric that's like very present in Hollywood right now about like telling authentic stories and hiring like people who have those experiences to create the films that, you know, are about their own communities. And to a certain extent I agree, but to another extent I don't, because I'm thinking again about like the use of like refugee labor in like Vietnam War films, and not just refugee laborers, but just like brown and black people's labor. So like in another film they use Filipino villagers to be extras, you know, and they're like paid a low wage. So what does it mean for them to be quote unquote employed in this film? So while there's like a power to like telling your own stories, I think it's like embedded in this like bigger system, and that's what I'm trying to understand through this project, even though I'm in a very micro way focused on making my own little film, which is like its own hard journey in and of itself. That's it.
Thank you.
Cool. First of all, I want to say that was a really great response, Quyên. And to answer your question, Evan, wait, I think it's important to think of, it's important to realize, I guess, that as similar and as much as we talk about the ties and indigeneity between Pasifika people and North American First Nations, it's important to realize that they come from very, very different contexts. Like, and for example, the North American First Nations have been on the continent for tens of thousands, if not more years, while the Pasifika people only settled relatively recently, like 900 AD. So there's that context to think about as well. But also, it's the concept of voyaging and being out on the ocean is so baked into our culture, and is so baked into our heritage. It's hard to get away from that idea that the ocean is kind of what we think of as our land. And there's been a lot of talk recently from creatives that the Pacific isn't our ocean, it's the Pacific is the largest continent. And I think that's something that kind of speaks to what you were asking about, is that that's how we consider the ocean, is that it's that important. We are not an ocean of islands, there's not an ocean and islands, it's a sea of islands. And I think, so there is, to answer your question, there is already that idea that the ocean is our land, and you kind of need to sift through the in-betweens and what we have already out there to see that. And yeah, I guess that's my answer, is that yes, we in our case, the ocean is our land. And I think we tend to have a very holistic approach to thinking about the ocean and our islands and our ancestral connection to it, while still recognizing that we are voyagers, that we come from this tradition of people who had to set forth and who had to speculate on what was out there to start settling.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to pass on to Weiying first a recommendation that Professor Zhou Jian, he had to log off earlier, but he wanted me to just pass on that he noted the resonance between your presentation and Paul Virilio's War and Cinema. I have another sort of recommendation to make. Jill Lepore, the American historian, just came out with a book called If Then. That's about, it's not about visual simulation. It's about this company called Simulmatics that was famous or infamous for using voter data modeling and projection for JFK's 1960 presidential campaign, but then was later contracted by the Department of Defense to do battlefield simulations as well, unsuccessfully, but they received millions and millions of dollars for it. But there's a kind of overlap there of the sort of simulating technologies that you're thinking about, and that kind of and war, obviously, but that sort of Vietnam War moment. So are there any other questions?
Can I just jump in real quick also with the recommendation?
Yeah.
Hi, such a wonderful panel, really inspiring talks. I just wanted to ask Greg if you know about the book, which I just finished reading, called Wild Blue Media by Melody Jue, media scholar based in UC Santa Barbara. So I was struck by your point about the alternative understanding of ocean as land. But this book actually tries to argue that thinking about ocean while blue media allows a disorientation of our terrestrial bias in terms of thinking of the ways in which we inhabit land, and how that perhaps conditions the way we think about a language, think about future. So I just wanted to mention that. And I was also struck by the linkage between the two papers in terms of materiality, as I guess Dr. Gandhi already mentioned. So really inspired by your talks. Thank you so much.
I will jump in if it's okay. Can everyone hear me? Okay, thank you. So congratulations and thank you to all the panelists. This was really, really interesting. And I was also really curious about, Shelley was asking about speculation or the speculative, but I was also really curious about how each of you were approaching the idea of technology, just sort of more broadly, because I was thinking in terms of like, for example, like Quyên, is it Quyên? I'm sorry, I might be mispronouncing your name, and Greg, and I was really struck by the kind of differing ways that the both of you were talking about technology. Nguyen, sorry, I apologize. And because in Wing's talk, you were talking about like how technology, even though it kind of enables the non-destruction, right, of these spaces in Southeast Asia, right? So it removes kind of the necessity of actually blowing the things up in these countries. There's still a way in which it's all still the same. We're still watching a representation of Vietnam being blown up, right? Whether or not that destruction is actually physically happening on a film set or not, the way it is in like Apocalypse Now. And then Greg's paper talking about the possibility of these kinds of different technologies as a way of thinking, through or thinking about solutions to the problems that climate crisis is going to cause in the Pacifica region. And then Qianru, I was really struck about technology just because your use of the idea of the palimpsest, right, which is about this kind of layering. And I'm thinking, of course, about the Angel Island poetry and the technology, right, involved in inscribing those poems. And I realized you're not as interested. I mean, that wasn't the focus of your paper, but I just invite all of you to kind of speculate or talk a little bit about what you think technology does or is not doing, or the context for it. So thank you.
You can go in presentation order again if that's easier for folks. Zoom makes everything difficult.
Okay, then I can go. So I think I might have a answer that's similar to like how I'm dealing with speculation, especially in regards to technology. And for the ARC, technology is more about like extracting resources, and for the Centenal cycle technology is a little bit more different in controlling our information and using that as kind of mode to promote like peace or promote like kind of like sense of belonging. But what I find interesting about both of the works is that like they set up so that like the over reliance on technology that is just assumed that like if we make everything just like balance out completely, then we will be able to work through the kind of like the contentions within the borders and in terms of distribution of like space and like resources. That over reliance gets really questioned by the end, and especially with the centennial cycles, like information is supposed to provide information that is like fact checked and transparent on levels so that everybody's informed, so they will be like more like encouraged to make the decisions that kind of like brings about justice when it actually does not. And especially some of the things are very like particular to the US context that is like more striking to read now than like a few years ago when they came out, in terms of that how misinformation can be used to like bolster up white supremacy that defines that as like, oh, it's not about democracy but liberty and freedom, but does not really put pressure onto what liberty and freedom means, and technology is enabled to cut off those forces. So there is a kind of like recalibration of like how we approach technology by the end, I think.
I think a large part of what I always talk against is sort of what I understand to be like this maybe Silicon Valley kind of idea that electronic technology and automated tech is gonna lead us to innovation, which is like untied to the past and into the future. And so when you asked me what I'm thinking of as technology, I think it really challenged me because in cinema, it's like all tech, but tech could be anything. So I'm gonna say that I think there's something to do with like the reconfiguration of labor. And that's like where I think most of my interest is like when we're talking about computers, I am not so much focused on the engineers that invented the computers, but I'm interested in like the people who have to assemble the parts, or like even thinking further, like where do they get these materials, like quote unquote raw materials from? What does that do? I didn't get to it in my presentation, but sort of like in a bigger global context where there's like low wage labor and free trade zones and all of like transnational factories like outsourcing not only like visual effects design, but like the actually creation of graphics cards and things like that, that technology always kind of displaces labor or like obscures it into like different ways. And I'm always thinking also of that story that I read about Filipino people who have to like check Facebook for the kind of like banned content and stuff like that, like things that when it kind of erases a certain kind of labor, it creates this other kind of labor. And it's like that kind of displacement that I'm trying to trace, but I haven't done it in in depth, so I can't tell you more than that kind of like fleeting thought about it.
Oh boy. I could do an entire talk on how technology and innovation has kind of been very extractive and violent towards Pacific Islanders and indigenous people in general. But I mean, that would just be way too long for a single question. And I think at this point, it's a little hard to, because there's like two modes of thought within the Pacific Islander, and I guess I might even say like the larger indigenous community, where there's the thought of the people who want to go like back and like want to use the traditions only as they were told to us. And then there's the kind of the futurists within the indigenous and Pacific Islander context who want to change, but who want to still use the heritage. And there's that conflict within the community about how to use technology, especially in like one of our biggest ones right now is GMOs within Hawaii, because just a little note that we do consider a couple of our plants like literal ancestors and cousins. So to go in and use GMO technology on that is very sacrilegious and disrespectful to a lot of the culture in Hawaii. So there's that conflict with technology. And then, but my personal view on technology, and especially speculative technology, is that it's the genie's kind of out of the bottle. And if we want to make sure that this technology isn't used to harm us, we kind of need to take the reins, and we need to put our interests first if we want to make sure that these colonizers and these larger forces don't overwhelm us. So I hope that rambling answer was good enough for you.
Thank you, Dr. Li, for this really rich and really rich question. Writing and rewriting is always very important to me. Actually, thinking about the writing, the spatial repertoire, writing and rewriting on the island, I was inspired by the carving on the wall. Thinking about, wow, so you left a mark on the wall, how about other things left the marks on the island? So that's one layer of the thinking. I'm thinking through it. So thinking about, you know, the the installation of the military bases on the island, and not to mention the island also has another Cold War layer. I briefly mentioned it was also a missile site, and the Nike missile site was on the island as well. So in thinking through, there's so much going on other than the 30-year of immigration experience of people from the Pacific. I began to ask myself, so how about those invisible and fluid carvings that were made through people's movement? For instance, quarantine, detention. What do I take of that? Because I'm a performance studies scholar, I can't just say, oh, whatever remains is the archive for me. I have to attend to the body. I have to attend the ghost in a space. The carving to me is actually the ghost that is like the residue are still in that space. And I keep thinking, hey, so afterwards, the immigration station was used to be a detention center for prisoners of war. Do they talk to each other? Do the ghosts of the Chinese immigrants talk, like what the conversation would look like? So that's where what brought me to this paper right now. Thank you so much for this question.
Thank you for those. Thank you for those answers, guys. It was very, very helpful. So thank you.
This has been such an awesome conversation so far. We have about 10 minutes left, so probably like 2 or 3 more questions. I just wanted to sort of take moderator's privilege and offer an observation about, and this kind of loops back to Shelley's first question about the work that speculation, that term, that concept of speculation, different forms of it are doing in each of your work. But I was also struck, I think this is along the same lines, I was also struck by the recurrence of the trope of the palimpsest across all of your presentations. Of course, Qianru and Heejoo, you mentioned it explicitly, but I mean, thinking about Greg's and Wuying's presentations as well, I noticed that there is this kind of dynamic of layering. For Wuying, you were mentioning the sort of visualization and pre-visualization, the mapping, the kind of relationship between war and the need for representation or simulation. So I was wondering, I mean, this may be this is more of a comment than a question, so feel free to respond to it if you like. But I was just wondering if there is a connection, or what you see as the connection between the dynamics of the palimpsest or economies of representation and the speculative modes that each of you take up. So that was just a sort of general question building off an observation. I do have one specific question though for Greg, and this gets to, you might be able to call this kind of layering or palimpsest too, but you know what you mentioned, and this is picking up on Wing's evocation of Silicon Valley, but you mentioned, Greg, the sort of Silicon Valley libertarian separatist fantasy of having these floating islands that I'm sure that we've all heard about and laughed at. So there's that, and then your preference for taking up what you call past solutions by indigenous communities that are doing more or less the same thing, but they have a sort of different origin point, right? And so that's a kind of, I guess that's a layering of these two solutions, but it does present this kind of, I'm not sure what it is, like a marketing problem or a branding problem. Perhaps it's a philosophical or political problem as well, but you have these two projects that seem very, very compatible with each other, right? But that have these extremely divergent and contradictory, political aims, and also just sort of, motivations behind them. So I don't know if that's an actual question, but I mean, if you could say more, I guess, about that conflict.
I guess, like, in my mind, it's very easy to separate the two as like one being very colonistic and exploitative of like this situation in the Pacific, coming from like the Silicon Valley people who want to, have their fun to make their own personal nation. That's, in my mind, that's incredibly selfish, and that's incredibly, like, it's it's like the pinnacle of Silicon Valley, where they think like if they just get everything that they want, that they can make their own perfect utopia, and as long as they get to pick whoever they want to come onto this island and they get to design everything. While what I'm proposing for the Pasifika floating cities is very like, I don't want it to be that. I want it to be the opposite, where, you know, the people whose lands are, the people who are most in need get to be the ones who decide what these cities are going to look like, not the people with the most money, not the people with the most Twitter followers, not the, you know, not Elon Musk, definitely. And like, my vision, I guess, for these Pacific floating cities are not like, in my mind, I guess I'll need to illustrate this at some point with like actual visualizations, but like from what I've seen, these visualizations of floating cities by these Silicon Valley millionaires are always so clean. They're always so perfect. Meanwhile, what I envision for these Pacific floating cities are kind of like patchwork. These are growing cities that like aren't perfect at first, sure, but they'll keep improving. They'll keep on being added to. They'll keep on changing. So that, like you said, they seem to be very similar at first, but like when you really think about the motives, when you think of the core ideas and themes behind these projects, they couldn't be more dissimilar.
Could I ask a question? And I apologize. I've had like this event has overlapped with other meetings for me, so I apologize that I've had to come in and out. This is a question for Weiying. I really enjoyed your paper. I just wanted you to like. I love Kong Skull Island. I think it's. I like movies like that in general. I'm just really struck by. I mean, like, I guess I have just a kind of a very simple and like kind of dumb question about the movie, and which is just like, how do you read Kong? And I find like the whole kind of plot of that movie. It's like I'm just looking at it on Wiki now. Like you know, it's a you know they're coming back for unfinished business from World War II, like 29 years later. So you know, it's set during the Vietnam War, and it's shot in Vietnam, but it's not acknowledged as Vietnam, right? You know, one of the pilots is named Marlowe. There's another character named Conrad, right? And so there's a kind of like a nod to the original, you know, literary context where it all sort of begins. Like, there's a kind of recursiveness to the story. I guess like the kind of dumb question that I just wanted to ask is like, how do you read Kong in that situation? I'm just kind of interested in like kind of like the way, I mean, if there's anything that is sort of baldly allegorical, it's a monster, right? So Godzilla always stands for a certain kind of urbanization. Kong in earlier iterations, I'm thinking of the 33 Kong stands for a certain kind of like juxtaposition between the primitive and the cosmopolitan, right? So I guess I'm curious just to know, given that this is so layered, right? And it has like, you know, it refers both to Apocalypse Now, refers to Heart of Darkness, it refers to the Vietnam War. At this, you know, it's a return to Vietnam, like to finish unfinished business, which is, you know, it seems to resonate with the way Vietnam is talked about nowadays as like a sort of newly open market, right? I'm just kind of curious just how you deal with all of those different kinds of strands, and specifically how Kong, how you're thinking of Kong itself as a kind of figure.
Yeah, thank you for that question. This is exactly why I look at the production and not the film itself. Well, I think it is like a lot of different layers, and I you know, I can't quite make out what for those of you who have seen it, what like Kong represents, because in a way, like you mentioned the 1933 film, and I am very influenced by sort of like the reading, the kind of racializedness of it. And I think it's too simple to say, okay, like now that is just being applied to Vietnam. I think that like my answer, maybe to keep it simple, has something to do with like thinking about it as a genre. So like when they refer to Apocalypse Now, is it like a genre thing, or is it like a referral to like the Vietnam War, but not the Vietnam War's like visual history, if that makes sense? And I think that's where like I got confused, and I kind of give up on reading films at this point, and kind of read the production, because it's more clear to me what that kind of like enables us to see. So I'm sorry, I'm actually not answering your question at all, but I think it has something to do with like Apocalypse Now, not as like a representation of the Vietnam War, but like Apocalypse Now and like the kind of films that create this visual history. And like it kind of came up with Spike Lee's The Five Bloods, where people are like, if you love Vietnam War films, you know, like all the conventions, and now it's just like a meta exercise that Spike Lee is now making a Vietnam War film, but it's not actually about Vietnam. It's just commentating on the genre that has since developed.
Yeah, I guess I wasn't looking for some kind of like kind of political reading or anything, and actually more of like a kind of, I was thinking more kind of industry terms. I mean, like the 33 Kong is famously stop motion, right? Stop motion action, and you know this, you know, like when you're talking about you know contemporary filmmaking and contemporary monster movies, it's not even, we're not even talking about an image anymore. It's information, right? So it's like CGI, and both involve a certain kind of filmic labor. Like, and I was thinking that there's a kind of interesting analog between the people that you're talking about, like your father assembling, you know, things in factories, and the kind of like the kind of non-artistic work, like the kind of like very kind of instrumental labor that goes into filmmaking. Like I'm thinking of just like CGI as a certain kind of just like, you know, like mathematical labor that is kind of, it seems really interestingly resonant with like the people that did the stop motion in the 30s. Like there's this whole sort of layer of filmmaking that's like kind of just technical, and very much like labor as labor rather than like labor as like recoded as art. Anyway, so that there's something that I thought might be something you could do something with in terms of how you begin to think about, you know, the film.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate the point about cameras also becoming data, because a lot, I'm actually not sure what camera the Kong was shot in, but I know that a lot of the more high-tech cinema cameras are no longer using the kind of mirror technology where, you know, like the light hits the film and it becomes the film, but now it's like actually a bunch of data points that get reinscribed into an image. But I'm looking at the chat. Okay.
All right, so it is 3 o'clock, but I do have another question that came in through chat that I'd like to pose to folks, to the panelists, if they don't mind just staying for a few more minutes. Is that cool? Just maybe this will be the last question. Does thinking about borders and the speculative position as defining the borders of possibility? Actually, do you want to, Jenny? Are you still there? Do you want to ask this question yourself?
It's kind of half-baked because I'm really new to thinking about this in general, but looking at the title of the panel and then hearing these great talks, it really made me think about speculation or speculative as a liminal kind of term in terms of what can be possible, or drawing a line between crossing over into possibilities. And I was just wondering, and this can be seen in so many different ways in these 4 papers that were just really interesting. And I was wondering if people had thoughts on that. I guess I would say I would define that again too, like in terms of imagination and in terms of like perspective futures. or kind of solutions. There's kind of a difference, I think, between the imagination and like a solution-based speculation, even thinking about finance and things like that.
Any responses they'd like to share?
I think I thought I was going to say something, but I just blinked out, so I'm going to mute myself.
Oh, no. Blame it on Zoom.
I personally think speculation is important to anything that humans want to accomplish, especially in terms of creating solutions, like practical solutions. I think you can't do anything without like a focused intent behind it, especially if you want to actually produce positive change around the world. So, I mean, like, I'm all for speculation, and especially using speculation in good, solid solutions. And I mean, that's so much of our work is figuring out how exactly to transition that to like real world applications. So I've talked a little too much, so someone else start talking, please.
Heejoo, did you want to go?
Go first.
It's like a lag, so I can't tell if I'm talking over you. Like in terms of borders, I always try to ground myself in like what specifically I'm talking about, because I know that there's a large body of work about borderlands, borderland studies, transborder studies, and like borders as conceptual or like national borders, et cetera, et cetera. But I think in terms of speculation, I'm always like very, I think, hopeful that we should always be able to imagine the future we want to live in. But also, like, I guess the negative side of me, and that's where the scholarship comes in, is like the side that's like, but we don't want a borderless world because capitalism, you know, and things like that. So that's kind of what like motivates my work. So I think like my artistic side is like, yay, and then my scholarly side is like, but you don't want the multinational corporations to take over the world. So I don't know if that answers exactly your question, but yeah, I don't know. I think borders are not as rigid as we think they are, and a case study even of like national borders, even the most militarized ones, will show us that.
Yeah, I think I can kind of piggyback off like what we just like mentioned, and also correct too, because I think the kind of struggle that I had was that like I wanted speculation to have this like potential, but I think I also posed a question of scale, and then all these four papers working together inspired me a lot in thinking through we need to like find ways to wedge things apart, but also it might apply differently for vastly different geographic context, but all of these embedded histories. And what struck me in all of our presentation was that like we all use a lot of maps, and then like of the different geographic parts, and then try and like wedge apart like the embedded history there, but and then provide a little bit of more speculative outlet for each of the locations. And then island wasn't such central to my project, but after like hearing everyone else's, I was like, oh, like what if we, like as Greg mentioned, like try to like think through indigeneity in different formats, that voyaging is also a part, and then we are moving away from this kind of territorial bias on the land. So I was like, oh, that's another kind of like outlet that I hadn't thought about. And then I think finding these little pockets might be the way to like find solutions that are not totalizing. So I'm not sure how we'll be able to do that in actual life. And then there would be further questions to answer, but I think that was like my takeaway from all of everyone else's papers.
Thank you so much for this question. To me, border is a contact zone. So in thinking about, I really appreciate the question that you asked, that whether it's a pure imagination or it's a solution-driven proposal style of speculation. I think in my case, it's more for the former. I think because my goal is to actually invite everybody to to appear in the same space, I don't think I can offer one solution to fix all the problems. And I think that's what's unique and very fascinating about border, is because there's so many encounters happening in the same time. And once we actually allow people to actually emerge, that's just so nuanced. Maybe that will lead us to somewhere else other than thinking about, oh, can we have one solution to fix the problem? Is there another space or something else? I don't have words to describe that. And that's actually my speculative future.
Thank you so much. So we've gone way over. You guys have been handling Q&A for almost an hour now. So this has been a really wonderful conversation. But you know, let me just invite everybody to thank our panelists. Thank you so much for those wonderful presentations. I think, you know, we can agree that, you know, just to bring Amy Bong back into this, and that even though speculation doesn't provide a guaranteed methodology for resistance from below, it provides at the very least an opportunity for these pockets of possibility, as Heejoo put it. And as a farewell, I just want to reiterate one thing that Heejoo said in her presentation, which is that this time of COVID puts pressure on borders and demands that we create alternate modes of care that aren't dependent on forms of citizenship or the kinds of subjectivities that are imposed by ideologies of the border. So on that note, everybody take care, and I hope to see everybody next week for our next panel, Knowing Toxicity. Thank you so much.